starting out with the objectives that were used. At least I was asked to provide objectives so that this session could be advertised. So I don't know if those actually made it into the materials that were a part of the factors in your decision to take this particular session or not. But this is sort of truth in advertising. This is what I said we were going to do. So I want to make sure that if that's what brought you here, that we accomplish those goals, because I know your time is valuable. So this is the order in which I advertised them, and I'm gonna try to go through all of these. I did want to say that since we only have 90 minutes, the part about the reviewing the frameworks for integrating content, pedagogies, and assessment practices is something that I'm just going to do a little bit of scratching the surface around that, just some basic stuff. There's an article over here that I made a copy of that I wrote a while ago, but it's sort of a how-to begin to think about content transformation across the curriculum if you want to do more of that. So really what I'm going to talk about a little bit is creating inclusive climates in the classroom, and a little bit about pedagogical approaches that are more general, that can apply really in any situation. And then if you want to think more comprehensively and in a more drilled down fashion about if you're teaching in science or mathematics or technology or English or whatever it is, how you would actually look at content transformation to integrate more what we call multicultural educational content, how you might apply pedagogical practices that are really in many ways uniquely adapted for your content area, and thinking about assessment in a way that is grade level specific and content specific. The article will get you started on that. It's still written from a generalist perspective, but there are some specific examples of people doing this work. And because it was written a while ago, there's more examples now, and I'm happy maybe at some point to come back and do something that would be more specific on that multicultural curriculum transformation piece, if people are interested, if there's interest in that at some point down the road. But you can always contact me independently as well. So, so this is our goal for this morning. I wanted to start with the questions piece, and this I tend to do presentations like this so that I'm sort of I'm thinking of you as this is a training of trainers. So I am actually providing you with an educational experience, but I'm stepping out of that role too, and I'm talking to you as though you're teaching. And that, so I'm going to explain what I'm doing so that you understand that what I'm trying to do is walk my talk, at least to an extent, recognizing that I'm using one pedagogical method right now, right? So I'm pretty much doing direct instruction, and I'm lecturing. It's like a mini lecture. And that's primarily because of the format and the time frame. But if you were taking a class with me, I would do a lot less of this, or I would do it more in the beginning and then less as the class moved forward. I would do a lot more activity-based kinds of things, and inquiry-based learning, project-based assessment, things like that. So here, what I'm doing is what's called formative assessment. Many of you know that, where I'm trying to access prior knowledge in the room, like what do you already know? So that even though we have an agenda, I can, as we move through that agenda, try to scaffold it so that it meets you where you are, and I get a sense of where people are in the room. But also, you know, if it turns out that what your questions are not what was our agenda, we don't have to follow the agenda. We can do something different. So I want to just spend a little bit of time asking you about, you know, did you just pick this workshop because it's one that was convenient for you and it checks the box on your certificate, or are there really specific things that have come up for you around this topic that you know, you're not sure how to deal with, or that have not gone well, or that did go really well that you feel good about, and you just want to sort of check in about that? Do you have questions that are theoretical in nature about this topic? It's a complex, controversial topic. I'm used to that. Or is there just something else that you want to ask? So I just want to get a sense of what's going on with folks in the room. Go ahead.
Well, first, when I signed up, it was just for the certificate, but the last few weeks there's actually, because I've been in the classroom for the first time and with the first year seminar, there's been some situations where I was like, I wish I could have handled that better. For instance, and this is just one example, one of the students, we were talking about the library, is like, well, I don't go there because there's gross homeless people there. And like we had to move on because we had a guest speaker, but I was just like, you know, if I had the time, I would have addressed that better because it was such a what is it, naive. I don't think it was a hateful statement, but it was just, you know, something that I thought, no, that's not what I want in my classroom, is those kind of statements.
Okay, that's a good example. Thank you. Go ahead.
I think for me, what I've noticed over the few semesters of teaching is with the diversity issues also come problems in various levels of learning as a starting point when they enter your classroom. So how do you address or teach to students who, some of them come in and have a very, very almost non-operational version of their understanding of English and of the topics, and some have come in who I teach in political science, who have very advanced understandings of the political institutions or their civics classes that they came from high school. And so both teaching toward either the middle or the high end or the low end, and then also generating the assessments, because you know, if you generate assessments that are too difficult for most of the students, then you have a lot of people falling off the train, and then if it's too easy, then people don't feel like they're learning or they don't take it seriously. So just kind of finding that right balance or sweet spot between the varying levels that come with diversity, I think is my big question.
That's a really good question as well. Anything else? So, if something else comes up, let me know, right? We can stop and revisit other questions as they percolate. And I know people need different amounts of process time, right? So that's another me stepping out of context for a minute and saying, so what I just did is I asked you on the spot. And so some people are really quick processors. Some people tend to be more conceptual. They need more time. So another strategy that I could have done with this same activity that I just did is I could have said, everybody take out a piece of paper, take 2 or 3 minutes, jot down a question or concern that you have. That lowers sort of the anxiety for people who are not quick processors, who can't just talk like these two did really quickly, right? And I could have structured the activity so we go around the room, right? And then that would ensure that everybody would have some time to think about it, come up with something that they want to say, or not, right? And then we could do the activity that way. Because our time is limited, I just wanted to do it, you know, the easiest, quickest way, right? Which is often how we make instructional decisions, right? And so that's something to consider over the course of a semester-long marking period, how you might build in process time. And this comes up a lot in my classes, is that, you know, especially if you're trying to manage participation dynamics, is who gets into the conversation. And I do a lot of work, and I'll talk a little bit about it, around we make group agreements for how we want to talk, how we want to communicate in the class. And then if things do not work well in terms of people dominating, we talk a lot about airtime, you know, how people are managing airtime. And so if things are not going well around the participation dynamics, we can go back to the group agreements and ask ourselves, are we participating in the way that we agreed to participate? And if not, let's revisit those agreements and then just sort of refresh our memory and then re-enter our conversation. And so there's just different strategies, but I will just say that process time is a big deal. And so anything that you can do to give students some, like, just a little bit of time to think before you're asking them to produce a response can really help students who think differently, right? And you know, there's a variety of reasons why some people might need more process time. It has nothing to do with content area knowledge or academic success or intellect or anything like that. It's just that we're all very different kinds of people and we process differently. And so you know, sometimes something works for one student, doesn't work for another student. And that's just a way of sort of creating more equity of participation as an example, right? The 2 points that you guys brought up, I think I'm going to touch on them to an extent in the presentation the way I set it up, but let me just briefly say that one, for the first comment about when students make problematic comments in the classroom, especially if you're teaching undergraduates, you know, one of the things that I learned quite a long time ago is that for many young people, okay, so let me backtrack. One thing that we know about issues of especially racial diversity, and I'll talk a little bit more about why race is so important, is that for most of us, no matter who we are in the United States, if we don't go to college or join the military, we're very unlikely to interact with people who are radically different from who we are. So when people go to college or into the military, they are often, no matter who they are, interacting with people who are different from themselves in a substantive way for the first time. And so when students experience exposure to diversity, if they're not prepared for it, they have negative reactions to it often. And I worked at the University of Maryland College Park, and we actually had issues in the fall semester where kids that were living in the dorms, right, because it's even, more kind of forced proximity to difference than it is in the classroom or in other spaces on campus, where we had what we call bias incidents. They didn't typically rise to the level of a hate crime unless property was destroyed, like by graffiti. But they might be like somebody scratching an epithet on a dry erase board or something like that. And so we wanted to document those, and they tended to be religious in nature, racial in nature, or related to sexual orientation, which kind of makes sense when you think about the kinds of conflict that we have in our society. But by spring, those incidents went way down. So within 6 months of sort of socialization to a university community, the students were more comfortable with it, and we didn't have that same kind of anxiety because we really leaned into it, and we worked to make people feel more comfortable about what it meant to live in a diverse community. And so one of the things that I have done with undergraduate students around this issue is I don't shut down, I don't police speech. Obviously, I can't allow problematic speech to come up in the classroom because it would make some students feel really unwelcome and unsafe. But I also don't want to tell people, shut up, right, or just shut it down. I want to create an opportunity, and sometimes, we get preoccupied with covering content, right? I have to cover content, I can't deal with this thing that just happened. But I find that if you can take a minute and deal with that thing that just happened, then covering content gets a lot easier. If you don't deal with it, then there's like an elephant in the room, and sometimes the elephant gets bigger, it puts on a pink and purple tutu, it starts dancing around the room, and then you kind of lose control because there's so much mental energy being directed at that. So what seems like a diversion actually helps you to get back on task. One strategy that I've used in classes with especially undergraduate students is what I call an ISMS board. And so it's just and I keep it with me because I don't want to leave it in a room or on a board where it's not being narrated or the context is inappropriate. But what I'll do is a part of the group agreements process, if people use problematic speech or terms, and sometimes people just don't know better. So, that there's a complex relationship between what I say intent versus impact, right? Is that sometimes people will say, well, I didn't mean it that way, and people will say, yeah, but it affected me that way, right? And so it's not that one is more important than the other, but we have to deal with that relationship between somebody's intent and the impact that it had on somebody. So what I try to do with the ISMs is, if somebody uses speech or terminology that somebody else finds problematic, when that happens, people, sometimes I'll play around and say, you can ring a buzzer, you can do whatever it is that is a way for you to cue that the speech was problematic. We'll put it on the ISMs board, which is a way to cue the class that it's not speech that we should probably use in the classroom for a reason. So once it goes on the board, it's highlighted. And then we talk a little bit about the term. People say what they meant by it, other people say how it affected them. And what I find is that for very many students, they understand that there are things they're not supposed to say, but they've never been given the opportunity to ask why, because people think it's impolite. It comes out of this whole colorblind philosophy of the 1970s, though well-intended, actually has the opposite impact, right? Is that we don't not notice, so pretending that we don't not notice actually makes the problem worse than addressing it directly. And so because of that old philosophy from the 70s, people think it's impolite, right, to ask questions. And so often these young kids, they think, I've been told I can't say this, but I've never been given an opportunity to talk about why. And if you're anything like me, I was one of those really obnoxious kids that, followed people around and asked why like 10,000 times a day. So if I didn't have a rationale for it, I couldn't process it, right? I needed to have a reason. I needed context, right? And so I find that just a very brief conversation about these terms when they come up, it's a very freeing thing for young students in particular, and it creates an open and honest conversation in the classroom. People say, oh, it's okay to ask questions, to get an answer. And I remind students that you maybe don't want to follow people around outside of a classroom context. I mean, you can ask, but you don't necessarily know if people outside of a classroom are going to respond as favorably to you asking questions. So you really need to build a relationship with people before you start asking, questions that relate to issues of equity and diversity. But once you build that relationship, then that creates the context for people to be able to ask questions and to respond and to create an exchange for this kind of conversations. So that's just one way that you can think about doing it. But like I said, you don't want to leave negative terms in a room after you leave. So my philosophy is that if I write something on the board that I know is problematic, I'll take it off the board before I leave. If it's something that is just instructional, I'll leave it on the board and then somebody else can erase it, because I figure it'll spread a little bit, right? But with something like that, because you want to keep a running list, I will actually keep it on an easel pad, like Post-it note paper, and then I'll bring it each class period for the marking period, right? And I'll use it that way. And I think particularly with young students that it's a very effective strategy, but there's lots of ways. I mean, you could deal with it just in the agreement process, creating those group agreements. How do we want to participate? How do we want to communicate? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we progress. On the other issue, which is about differentiating instruction for students who have different academic levels, I mean, that's an excellent question, and it's a big question here at UNLV because we are a primarily first-generation college student institution. And, it shouldn't surprise us that depending on, where you grew up, the quality of your education, your high school education is really going to be related to where you grew up, your zip code, right? We know that zip code is the biggest predictor of the kind of education that you get, right? So a student could be a 4.0 student at a prep school and a 4.0 student in an inner city high school, or a 4.0 student in a really rural country school. But those 4.0s, they tell us something about that student from this lens of what we call non-cognitive variables. Like all those students are very motivated to succeed, so they all did very well wherever they went to school. But what they did, as a part of their school experience is very different, right? Because of the quality of education. So they're all good students, but they come with different levels of prior knowledge. And so that's why it's really important to do these formative assessments to get a sense of what do people know coming in. I just read an article, and I can send it to Ashley, that focuses on why lecture is problematic for this exact reason, is that lecture is problematic because it tends to work better for students that have more prior content knowledge, and so they can access it while the instructor is lecturing more easily than students who don't have the same level of prior content knowledge coming in the door. So one of the solutions that is suggested is to focus more on active learning, and I do a lot of that in my class. I do a lot of collaborative assignments. Students hate it, so you really have to not just put people in groups and walk away. You have to actively facilitate group process. But I find that it creates an opportunity for students with different kinds of skills to be able to contribute. So for example, in one of my classes, students do an immigration research project, and it involves visiting a community agency. It involves interviewing somebody who's been personally affected by immigration, community agency that works with recent immigrants, interviewing somebody who's been personally impacted by immigration, research on immigration policy. And then I think there's like one other activity that the student groups choose that they want to do to expand their knowledge. And the immigration policy is also about things that relate to immigration issues in education. And then they have to write up what they found. They have to come up with a theme, write up what they found, and then put it into one paper per group, formatted in APA and appropriately referenced, right? So if you think about all of those components of that assignment, it touches on different skill sets that a group of students coming from all three of those school examples that I gave you will probably have collectively. So I encourage students to think about how to divide labor in the class so that you're maximizing in the group. How do you divide the labor in the group on the project to maximize the different strengths and challenges that each of you bring, right? So some people are really willing to go out to a community agency and interview people. They love that. Other people are like, look, I got 6 kids, I'm working full-time, I'm taking 4 courses, I'll do the APA, I'm really good at APA, as long as I don't have to spend time outside my house, right? So that's a really, so everybody, and that creates community wealth in the group, right? Is that they can leverage each other's prior knowledge and use that together. And then I think, the question then becomes, does everybody learn at the middle level, like you were saying? Is that an assignment that targets the middle? I'm not sure it targets the middle, but I will tell you that it improves the skill set over, so if I have the same students over multiple semesters and I use this strategy, I can tell you that the students who are the weakest in certain areas within 2 or 3 semesters have substantially improved. Like writing improves substantially using these strategies. And I just think that sometimes students can learn things from each other that they can't learn from us as instructors. And so, though people always groan and complain about group projects, if they're structured well and we facilitate them well, they can be very transformational. In the article, there's also a description about another way to use assessment to address this issue. It talks a little bit about how you provide, it's a math example, and it was used at UC Berkeley. And the idea is that you give a group of students a math problem to solve, and then the instructor comes around and asks one student at random in the group just how they solve the problem, and then everybody's grade in the group is dependent about how that one student answers the question. So what you do is you create a climate in the group where they are invested in making sure everybody can answer the question. And this skyrockets people's performance in even what is considered to be really advanced mathematics. So another strategy that, again, focuses on using the community wealth in the classroom, right? The knowledge in the classroom. So just 2 examples to just really target what people had questions about coming in the door. So if folks are cool, I'm going to just move to the next piece, okay? And if you have another question, feel free to interrupt. Okay. So this may seem like, I always hear people say these are soft skills, not hard skills. And I don't really know what a soft skill is, because I think sometimes things that we call soft really are the core of making everything better. So if people feel welcomed and included in the classroom, or just by you as an instructor, that will change their investment in what you're teaching. I have many students that are really not that particularly interested in what I teach, but they like to be a part of the community that I create in my classrooms. And so I find it interesting that I have students who politically, my field is a field that it's a resistance discipline, right? A multicultural education has I would argue all disciplines have a perspective. We just don't deny that we have a perspective. And so I always say to my students, look, I have something to teach or tell you. I'm going to share with you sort of what this is about. You don't have to agree with it, but you do have to show me you understand it. And just because you agree with it doesn't mean you're going to get a good grade, right? So it's not like I'm not grading you on whether or not you like the material or you like the perspective of the field. I'm grading you on your scholarship. And so I think that's important to sort of set up ahead of time, because it makes students feel that you're fair, right? Because it's about, I'm going to grade you based on the rubric that I have in the syllabus, and whether you like what I'm teaching or whether you don't like what I'm teaching, that's not the basis of your assessment. And I think that's important. And then I also even say to students who, in some cases are really hostile to this content, the specific, because I'm not just teaching, I'm not just teaching diverse students, I'm actually teaching about diversity, right? So it's both content and who's in the room and my pedagogical approaches, right? It's everything. So there can be a lot of resistance, not just to me as an instructor, but to my content. And so I think that I will say to students, if you really don't like this topic, I'll tell you who the scholars are, in the academy, who argue this from an evidence-based perspective, a reasoned perspective. There are people, there's crazy people that argue all perspectives and all disciplines, right? But if you want to talk, there are legitimate arguments against what I do, and I lean into those critiques, and I want students to be conscious of, especially if they're interested in my content area, they're going to have to be prepared to respond to critiques. So if there are critiques in the room, it's important that we bring them forward, right? It makes us all smarter. So I think that it's important to create a climate like that, right, where there's an inquiry-based climate where people feel welcome and included, even if they're not necessarily you know, that particularly excited about what it is that you're teaching, for whatever reason that is, right? And so one of the things I spend a lot of, I made a decision a long time ago that I would give students time. And I find, like a lot of people think, that I maybe spend too much time with students, but I made a decision. I don't want to be one of those people that kind of opens my door partway and, you know, gives the student this message that, like, I'm busy, right? I got other stuff to do. What do you need, right? So when I'm available, and if I'm not around, right? And students know they can reach me by email, or if it's an emergency, by text. And so when I'm available, I'm completely available, and I find that giving time makes a big difference. A lot of times students just don't know, and this goes back to the question about people coming in with different sort of prior knowledge experiences based on the kind of high school that they went to, especially if they're a first-generation college student. They may not have somebody in the family that they can ask about things that we might take for granted if we're not first-generation college students, or if we're already at an academic level that's higher, we may forget what we had to learn coming in the door. So I find I spend a lot of time just helping students navigate things that may seem obvious, but they're afraid in cases to ask people because they don't want to sound stupid, or they feel like the instructor is inaccessible or doesn't have time for them, or they're afraid that it might influence their grade, things like that. So I think that the more you can do to just make people feel welcome before class, during class, after classes and courses is really important. I think that, you know, people will say my syllabi are overwhelming, but I at least make sure that they are comprehensive, that everything that students need is in them. I also have a real philosophy about walking my talk, so if I require students to use citations for everything, then when I put something in the syllabus, like my texts are in APA format, you know, my citations are complete, because I want to abide by the same rules that I have for my students. So I think that's really important. I think the syllabus should be well organized. It should be as much as possible free of errors. It should be accurate for what you're doing that semester, so the dates should be correct, you know, things like that, because even if we're redoing them from semester to semester, so it's, again, it's sort of like welcoming somebody into your home, right? You just you want it to be well organized, neat, and clean, and you want people to feel good about coming in, you know, so it's just another way that you translate that message. And then in the work that I do, there is a socio-political context, and I would argue that even if you don't teach in this content area, if you're welcoming in diverse students, you need to understand that there are power relationships that exist outside, and one of those power relationships is the quality of the education that you got before you got here, right? And so when you're talking about a student coming from a low-performing school, but they still got themselves here, right? Like, one of the things I love about our students is that many of them do come in with a lot of basic skill, you know, gaps, but they got here, and most of them got here based on sheer will and determination and intellect, not because they had sort of like the scaffolding to get here. So they come, and we do have to catch them up, and I see that as a civil rights issue. I'm an educator. I do research on educational inequities. I make money doing that. And so if inequity shows up in my classroom and I suddenly say that's not my problem, what a hypocrite am I, right? Because that's the problem in my classroom that I get paid to do research for, right? That I get paid to do speaking engagements for, that I go to conferences that focus themes on educational inequities, right? But then I'm going to say, well, I don't teach writing, or it's not my job to help students with APA because I teach this other content. It's so hypocritical. To me, you can't separate those two things. There is this larger sociopolitical context that's operating, and it's a big deal at a school like this, right? Because of our tremendous demographic diversity, but also that piece around, you know, the kind of prior educational experience that students got. But just remember, they got here, right? And so that in and of itself should tell us something about the kinds of students that we have. So I encourage people to think about the relationship between an individual, because in our system we tend to think about people as individuals, we value individualism, but from a multicultural perspective, not everybody looks at the world that way, and they don't approach education that way. They look at it more as a group experience. They benefit more from collaboration. And I would argue that we need both, right? That we need the ability to sort of operate as individuals and the confidence to do that. We also need to learn, and increasingly, which I'll get to pretty quickly, we need to learn how to work in teams very successfully, and so this is something that is a big deal right now across business and industry areas, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about educational benefits of diversity. People who knew me in grad school is an individual identity, right? So the relationship between who we are as individuals, I'm a teacher as an individual, but that's also a group identity, right? So, but there are some group identities that are immutable, that we really can't change. And then there are some group identities like profession and things like that that we've chosen. And so it's those immutable identities that are really where the sociopolitical context comes from, right? The things that we were essentially born into, attributes that we have that give us certain kinds of advantages or disadvantages based on who we are, right? Not based on anything that we did. So being white didn't make me better or worse, but it did give me an advantage starting in the door, and so I start the race ahead of other people, not because I did anything to get there, just based on the luck of the circumstances of my birth, right? I didn't do anything to be born white, I just was. I didn't do anything to be born into an upper middle class, native English speaking American household, I just was. So I start the game, right, with some buoyancy that other students don't. And I think it's really important for us to remember that there is inequity walking in the room, and it's not because people did or didn't do anything. You know, it's not because of this myth of meritocracy or this idea that people worked hard or didn't. Yes, hard work is a factor in everybody's success, but it is not the factor in the way in which we walk into the classroom with, especially at early ages, right? In a kindergarten class, these inequities show up, and you can't say that that has really anything to do with what the kids did or didn't do to get there, right? It shows up in the room. And if we're going to address it, we have to look at it through this lens of equity and not equality, which means that we have to differentiate so that by the end of the class, people are in fact more equal, right? So that's this rub, and I'll give you a graphic to talk a little bit more about that. And then I also think it's really important to support and challenge, right? So I want everybody to feel welcome. I also want to push everybody. So I have to figure out what is, in differentiating instruction, I have to figure out where do you need to be pushed, right? And where do you need to be supported? And that's going to be different than you, and then you, and then you, and you, right? So I'm always sort of thinking about where is this student relative to the course? What do they get that they, that I want to support, and or where do they feel vulnerable that I want to build their confidence around? And then where do they really need to be pushed because they're not getting it, right? And they're not getting it because of a variety of different reasons, okay? So keep those in mind. And just as an example in the diversity context, right, it is often, if I'm talking about race, in my content area, right, I'm often going to find that white students feel way more put upon, and students of color, don't necessarily feel challenged. So how do I create a conversation about race that actually challenges students of color as much as it challenges white students? Otherwise, I'm not doing my job, right? So how do I structure a conversation to do that? Same thing around gender or any other dimension of diversity, is that I have to think about what is the experience that the student has that will, it's just more likely that if you're from a particular non-dominant group that you're more used to talking about those issues because they hit you in the face every day because of the sociopolitical context. If that's not something that you experience, that pushback, you probably don't think about it that much or talk about it that much. So when I get into a classroom with a group of students, for some students something's going to be really challenging, for other students it's not. How do I structure the learning, right, the conversation, in a way that re-engages people so that everybody is feeling that support and challenge balance? And it's going to be different in different content areas, so I'm giving you an example from my content area. All right, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I have created some prompts that I used with my own colleagues. I was asked to do this with my own colleagues because I have some degree of success in creating an inclusive culture in my department for students who are studying in my content area. So enrollments in my area are growing, and we have more students coming into the degree programs that I coordinate, and they are a robustly diverse group of students. And so I was asked to present some ideas to my colleagues, and when I was pulling these ideas together, I realized that my ideas are really discipline specific. So you will notice it's just a few slides of just things that are, I think, fairly self-explanatory. You can read them on your own, and what I said to my colleagues is, look, many of these are going to sound really weird, earthy, crunchy, way too out there for you. Oh, this is diversity, touchy-feely folk kind of stuff, right? And I said, you're absolutely right, they are. Even some of the terms that I used are terms that are meaningful in our field. Like they're terms that my students would recognize come from particular scholars in our field. But those are philosophies that I use to build a welcoming environment in the department, in the classroom, right, and in just the program itself, the programs that I coordinate. So I encourage my colleagues to think about what are the things that, because I think there are learning interest cultures, right? Like I think I attract a particular group of students who love what I love, right? And I think that's true for all of us. And so I think there's that learning interest culture. What is it in your content area that you teach in? I see evidence, even in my department, that there are students that go into math and the faculty in math. I think, to some extent, they have like a different intellectual culture. They have a different interpersonal culture. And I often feel like I feel hyper extroverted when I'm talking to math folks in my department. I become really aware of how much I use my hands, and I'm like standing there watching myself talk to people who literally are like this the entire time I'm talking. And it's a little, I recognize that there is a different sort of, there's a different communicative culture that may have something to do with the discipline. And I don't want to stereotype people by discipline, but I do want to recognize that we have different learning interests, and those different learning interests are reflective in some kind of experience that people have in those spaces. And I think, I work a lot with teachers, and I had a consulting gig many years ago where I was working with white women who were really interested in multicultural education at a private Catholic school. And I remember feeling like I had not been in a space like that in a really long time. And I remember feeling like, these are my people. Like, I could see that we share a lot of common experience. We're all white, we're all women, we're all teachers. We all independently chose to focus on how we can be more multicultural in our approach to teaching. And so I felt a great deal of congruency in the room with folks, right? I recognized that we shared certain features or attributes or interests that brought us to this common place, right? And so I really want you to think about that. When you read the prompts on these next few pages, which I'm just going to scroll through now, but we're going to make a copy of this presentation available. And think about, okay, that's not going to fly. Like I joke, there's some terms in here, I joke with my colleagues, okay, if your heads are exploding, just ignore it, right? But the idea really is, to think about what works for students in your content area. What is the interest that brings people to it? So I'll give one more example of this. A colleague of mine at a community college where I started my career, from Ethiopia, was actually a lawyer, but was having trouble getting licensed to practice law in the US because the system is very different. So he was teaching criminal justice at a community college, and he was aware that as a faculty member from outside the US, he spoke with an accent, he spoke English with an accent. He was worried, because students can be cruel, as you know, right, if you're a faculty member who speaks with an accent. He was worried that it could affect his ability to maintain his employment. He had a family to support as a new immigrant. So, smart, right? He decided, if I can create sort of like a learning interest culture in criminal justice, then people will forget that I have an accent, or the accent will no longer be a deterrent to people being engaged with me, and it will help me be successful. So what he did was he started having students argue cases, actual legal cases. And once they started doing that, he came up with this idea of using common time during the day at the community college, which was from 12 to 1:30, for the students to actually act out these cases in the common area. And anybody from the university, well, the community college community could come and sit in the audience, and occasionally they were drafted to sit on the jury. And then the law students would act as judge and attorneys and actually argue real cases, and then the audience and the jury would participate from the campus community. And this became super, super popular lunchtime activity, and it started to attract a lot of people to criminal justice. And then they started to have like a criminal justice prom. I mean, it was a community college, and a lot of the kids were very young, so like 16, 17, coming to community college. So there were things that they did that were, that really his reason for doing this was really to help people deal with his diversity. He knew he needed to be successful that way. But what he ended up doing was finding a way to create a culture that made being a criminal justice major cool, and then to leverage that into the interests of the students that he had in building that culture. Right? So that's just an activity, another example. So you can look through these at your discretion. The words that are sort of bolded are the ones that are important, and I'll let you look at those on your own. So again, giving people time, being responsive, being generous, willing to go. I mean, not rocket science, but a lot of things we don't do. All right. So this is probably, when you hear diversity, this is probably what you think about, that word, diversity. I did want to just say a little bit about that word because it's misunderstood. So I'm going to just read something that I've written about this. So I say there has been a lot of conversation about the meaning and the importance of the word diversity in our society, right? And it's kind of ironic because the word really just means difference. There isn't anything else to it except that the way the word has become understood in our society is that it is a good thing or a bad thing, right? So we attach value judgments to it just because of how it's sort of emerged in our collective conversation in the United States and maybe even internationally. So I think that most of us have a more complex understanding of it, and it tends to be at least somewhat controversial, that perceptions of the concept in our minds lead us to conclude that it is either an essentially beneficial, an important thing, or a troublesome and an irrelevant thing. And I argue that we find ourselves with this dichotomy because I think people like me have not done the job that we need to do to help people understand diversity more complexly, right? And I think it's really important for two things to be communicated. First, that diversity and inclusion are inextricably linked. People seem to think of those things as polar opposites, but you really can't have one without the other. And so I think that's very important for people to remember. That in order to celebrating diversity creates inclusion. People think that a focus on difference makes people divided. And that's a perception for people who are privileged, right? From a privileged identity, because if we only focus on sameness, then if you're from dominant identities, you feel comfortable. Right? But everybody else doesn't. And so we have to teach people who are not comfortable, right, with focusing on difference, that if they want everybody to feel comfortable like they feel when we don't mention it, that they have to learn how to talk about it in order for other people to feel welcome the way they feel all the time, right? So why do I feel welcome all the time? Because I walk in the world with a lot of privilege, and so I can enter spaces without really having to think too much about it, right? And if I want other people to feel that way, I have to create a space that does for them what the regular, dominant, normative, right, Eurocentric, we can use lots of words, space does for me. So if I'm a native English speaker and I walk into a space, the world does something for me, right? The space does something for me. But it doesn't do something for somebody who's not a native speaker of English. If I walk into the room with an advanced education, the space does something for me that it doesn't do for somebody that doesn't have advanced education, right? As I walk into the room as a white person, the space typically does something for me. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I mean by space, right, in a minute. But that's sort of what I want you to get at. So we need to create spaces where everybody feels included, and to do that, we have to get more comfortable just in general with difference. It just has to become, as one of the people in my field talks about, has to become understood as the normal human condition. Right? Multicultural, diversity, those words, they reflect the normal human condition. We are all very diverse because we all have membership in every one of these groups. So by definition, each individual is a member of every one of these. We have membership in a category in each one of these dimensions. Right? So how do we make people feel included is by figuring out how to manage the difference piece, right? To celebrate it, to affirm it, which is complicated because some people disagree with things that people do. So how do you celebrate and affirm something that fundamentally flies in the face with what you're comfortable with? And there's not a simple answer to that, but it has to do with understanding people, and understanding doesn't mean agreement. I'll mention this a little bit further as we move forward. Okay, so that's a way of thinking about diversity. And now I want to go to the other term, which is equity. And this is something I mentioned earlier, is the difference between equity and equality. I think this graphic is a good way of thinking about it, right? Is that we often think that equality is the one on the left, right? Because everybody has the same block. So the words are the opposite. I put them in the wrong order, so I apologize for that. In my heading, I controlled the heading. So the one on the left side of the screen, this is equality. But you see that if people are different, and this just uses one dimension of difference, right? Which is size or a physical appearance, right? In this case, height or age, we could think about it that way. We think of this, treating everybody the same, as equality. But actually it has, it has an unequal effect. So this is equity on the right. And it's really, this is scaffolding instruction, this is differentiating instruction. This is what we do in education, right, to create equity. And I would argue that by doing this, right, we create more equality. So we need equity to get to equality. A real-world example that happened here on this campus is that when we first opened a multicultural center here in 2009, we were trying to do different things to affirm different communities of students, right? And one of the things that I really wanted to do was to make the signage for the center bilingual. And this was very controversial, I would just tell you. So my rationale was, if you look at the demographics of Clark County Schools, and you looked at the demographics of UNLV, and you looked at the fact that we were in the middle of a budget crisis, it made sense for us to do something that would be particularly welcoming to students who were Spanish speakers. Because we had 40% in the district at that time and only 12% on campus. So if we were looking to increase our enrollments to address our budget issues, that was the group that we were not targeting proportionate to the local population. So there was, I think, a good argument for making the signage bilingual for that reason, right? But the pushback I got from that is, well, what about Chinese students? Or, what about students who speak, another language? Are we going to put all the languages on the sign? So this idea that by adding English and Spanish, that somehow that was unfair to people who spoke other languages. Ironically, the pushback was that it should just be in English, because being in just English was more fair than putting it in English and Spanish. So think about that for a minute, right? So, that's kind of ironic. But what was important to recognize is that that was just one thing that we were doing. Other things that we were doing were we were working on accessibility, because the space was not immediately accessible, so we had to figure out how to deal with making it a welcoming and affirming space for students who had disabilities. So we had to do something different for them. We had people donate different religious artifacts so that students from different, and this was not something we asked, it just happened. People wanted to be a part of it, so they brought us different kinds of religious artifacts, and we put them all up so that students, regardless of faith tradition, would see something in the space, the decoration, that would make them feel like they belong there. We had fraternities and sororities that wanted to give us pictures of their members to put up on the wall that they signed to the center, right? And so we didn't do exactly the same thing for everybody, but we did different things to affirm different groups. You can't do everything exactly the same way for every group. It would be, one, just financially and structurally impossible. So you have to sort of think about what makes sense at what moment in time and what's possible. And how do you create a space where everybody feels welcome, recognizing that it's not because you're treating everybody exactly the same, if that was even possible, but you're treating them equitably, and that through that equitable treatment, we hope that people have more equal opportunity and outcomes. All right. This is sort of what I talk about in that article, and this is really that fourth piece of the agenda that I mentioned early on, this idea of creating frameworks for success in the classroom. So in the article, I talked very specifically about how do you do these 5 things in curriculum transformation. And we've talked a little bit about climate and the environment a little bit already. We've talked about relationship building. I'm going to spend a little more time talking about pedagogy. Content is the hard part. That takes a lot more time. So that really is addressed in much greater detail in the article. And then I've talked a little bit about evaluation and assessment, but that is also discussed in the article a little bit more. So here's sort of what I've been building up to, and hopefully this will be beneficial for you, is that why do we care about diversity in higher ed in particular. And I was fortunate enough to be a part of a multi-university study that wanted to examine that question so that we could actually provide research, evidence-based, we could engage in evidence-based practice, that we actually know that there are educational benefits of diversity and we can develop curricular and co-curricular programs that take advantage of what we know, right, about those benefits. And so what we've learned from, and I can spend a lot more time talking about the study that we did, this multi-university study at some point, but right now I'm just going to focus on, what the conditions are and then the benefits, and then if you want to learn more about the study design, you can shoot me an email and we can have a cup of coffee and talk about it. There's certain conditions that have to exist in an educational environment in order for these benefits to accrue. And when those conditions exist, all students, regardless of who they are, they earn these benefits. So it's important to point out that the conditions create the opportunity for any student. For me as a white student, I get these benefits. For somebody as a male student, they get those benefits. Heterosexual students. So if you're from the dominant group and you are in a school where in an educational setting where these conditions exist, you will accrue those benefits. So I want to make sure that people understand this is not something that we're doing just for students who come from non-dominant groups or just for the non-dominant part of all of our identities, right? It's a holistic benefit. All these benefits accrue to all students if they are educated in educational settings where these conditions exist. So the conditions are that the setting has to be demographically diverse. And while all of those dimensions on the laundry list of diversity matter, race matters most. And that's because it's the hardest thing. So if you think about where, sort of the founding conditions of our society, race was a big factor in how the United States came to be. It was a big deal in a very problematic way. And it is still, that problematic way still occupies way more of our history than what's happened since we've sort of gotten away from that, at least legally. And so it's important to keep in mind that we have only been working in a positive way to deal with race, and with some success, but still with some substantial challenges. So this is our sort of the original sin, and it's still one that we're dealing with, right? So in order to really benefit from these to get these educational benefits in a really robust way, we need as much demographic diversity as we can imagine on all of those categories of difference. But if we have difference everywhere, so just to go back, we have difference everywhere except in those first three categories, race, color, and ethnicity. We have every other form of diversity, but we don't have those. There will still be some benefits that accrue, they just won't be as robust. And even if some of those other categories of diversity don't exist in the pool, if racial diversity does, the benefits will still be more robust. So race matters more, and it matters most. That may not always be the case, but it's the case right now. Okay? We have to deal with this. So what is enough? What is enough diversity, right? This is where this whole anxiety around quotas comes in, right? But the research doesn't really look at it from that lens. The research looks at the demographic diversity being robust enough if the other two conditions can be met. So the first other condition, the first of the other two conditions is informal interactional diversity. So what that means is that you're in an environment that's diverse enough that when you just walk around in that environment, you run into people who are very different from yourself, obviously and easily, in everyday interaction. You can't avoid it. It becomes part of your visual, psychological, emotional, intellectual landscape. And so you walk to the library, you sit in the library, you go to the student club, you walk into the student union. If you live on campus, it's in the dorms. If you go to the rec center, it's there. No matter where you go in all your classes, there is a lot of diversity in terms of who's there. And then the third condition is that there needs to be formal interactional diversity, which means we actually have to take advantage of it in the curricular and co-curricular environment. We have to do something with it. And so how do we do something with it? We teach courses specific to diversity, right? We have clubs that encourage students to do some kind of diversity-related event that they need in order to get their their funding. A lot of student clubs are required to do some kind of a diversity event, and with mixed success. Taco night's not the greatest one, but like an interfaith dialogue would be awesome. Or a black-white Greek dialogue would be pretty interesting, to have black fraternity, white fraternity talk. Things like that are more substantive, those really end up helping. And that's something that a student organization could choose to do on their own, and then they apply for funding, and then that actually helps create this condition. An instructor that teaches a course, or one of the examples I give in the article is of a professor that I worked with at College Park who is a cell biologist and a molecular geneticist, a guy named Robert Yuan, now retired. You think, okay, how does a cell biologist and a molecular geneticist do multicultural education? Well, he was really big on using intentionally mixed race, mixed gender groups for his assignments. And like I said before, he didn't just put people in groups and then throw them, leave them to themselves. He literally spent time in class working with each group to facilitate how they engaged each other around their demographic diversity in the group, and to leverage that as a skill. And so people resist that because they say it's engineering, but it's not going to happen if we leave it to choice. It is something that we actually have to learn to do. It's a skill, right? So the way that you get better at something, is you exercise the muscle, right? And we don't like going to the gym. Some people hire personal trainers because they can't get themselves there themselves, right? It's the same kind of thing with this, is that sometimes some people will choose it, but other people won't. They need a personal trainer, right? So this is sort of a way of thinking about, that's one way that we can teach people to develop this skill, right? All right, so if these conditions exist, and they do here, we are the 5th most racially and ethnically diverse institution in the country, something I'm very proud of, and a huge second, that may have happened very recently, right? Okay, so I'm behind, that's good news, right? And so we met that first condition, and what I'm really proud about is that it is both domestic, what we call domestic diversity, so students from historically underrepresented groups like Native American, African American, and Latino, what we say Latino as opposed to Latin American, right? So Puerto Rican, Mexican, Chicano, groups that are sort of indigenous, more indigenous to our history. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm asking because we're in a safe space here, but so is Latino better than saying Hispanic?
So it's a good question. Terminology is complicated, right? The rule of thumb, and that rule of thumb is actually a problematic expression. It's another time for another conversation. But sort of the rule that we say is that you want to ask people what they want to be called, right? And that specific is better than general. So you might want to say, and it goes back to what I said at the very beginning. So if you have a relationship and you ask somebody what you want to be called, it's probably better than if you walk up to some random person and ask them what they want to be called, because you don't have a relationship, right? So you need to think about context. But it's also important to remember that people have different reasons for wanting to be called different things, and sometimes people pick terms that are not, from the lens of people in my field, the best term, because we don't necessarily even know our own history and culture very well, right? So there are terms that we think are more respectful in our field, but that doesn't mean that everybody from those groups chooses those terms for themselves. And even some categories that we've created and that we use in this country are very unique to the US. We had a comedian at a conference that I went to many years ago who said he didn't know he was Latino until he came to the US, because the term has no meaning in the country that he's from. So that was kind of interesting to think about. I think that, so specific is better than generals, but that's not always a rule. Sinbad used to say, he was come to town and he wanted to hire black folks to work on his show when he was in town. And then he'd get young folks that would come in and say, hey, we're not black, we're African American. He'd be like, you can be whatever you want to be, but today I'm hiring black folks, right? And that's because he comes from my generation. And in my generation, the 1960s, we think of the Black Power movement, we think of black as beautiful. So that term has a very specific meaning for people in my generation. And African American is a newer term. And so some people feel that it is more specific than Black American or Black. And that's true, it is more specific, but then it gets complicated, because then you have people who are white but from Africa, or people who are black from Africa but have immigrated here, and now they're claiming this term African American, typically when we use that term, we mean people who are the historic descendants of enslaved Africans. So how do you get to that conversation, right? So I'm just giving you a thumbnail of how complicated this could be. So we're Hispanic, lots of people like it, we use it on the census.
Yeah.
It's an interesting term. It means, basically it means Spanish. It's an anglicization of the word Spanish, which is hispano or hispana. And so identify as Latino are a mix, just based on history. They're a mix of Africans, indigenous populations, native indigenous populations, and Europeans. And so the idea that we would name that group based on a term that only relates to their European origin is an interesting one, right? Now, if you look at the census, we treat Hispanic as though it is not the same as Black, White, Native American, or Asian. We treat it differently. We ask everybody to identify themselves as of Hispanic origin or not first. And then we ask them to choose race, which is interesting. And it's also of note that 80% of people who currently, today, identify as of Hispanic origin choose white. So it's interesting to think about, where does that come from, that consciousness come from? Why do people want to claim that European identity? You know, is it skin color? Is it racism? You know, like where does that come from? And you know, that's just a very, I mean, I could go hours on this topic, right? Because it is very complex. It's complex for white people too. When I've asked people to code, like HTML coding for choices for white people to be able to choose different terms for themselves the way we give for other folks, I've had white guys who work in IT get mad at me and say, well, I don't mind coding 15 options for every other group, but we don't need 15 options. We're just American. Why do you have to put white, white American, European American, Caucasian? I'm offended, you know, like why, you know? So it's interesting to think, like we have this issue ourselves, right, is this term. And people sometimes get frustrated and they say, I can't remember what those people want to be called, this is too difficult. And you know, my response to that is, we want to treat people with dignity and respect, right? So it should be something that we're willing to invest a little bit of time in, is sort of figuring out, how do I need to understand you in order to be able to convey to you that I have, you know, that I want to preserve your dignity and I want to communicate to you in a way that you will understand that I respect you. And I think terminology is really important. So sometimes, sort of again, going back to what is the rule, is specific is better than general, and you ask people once you have a relationship with them what they want to be called, how they want to be referred to, and then you honor that, recognizing that what people choose may not actually be what we consider in the research, in academia, in the field, to be the most respectful or current term. It's complicated. Does that make sense as an answer, even if it's not definitive? Okay. Okay, so what are the benefits? You have these conditions, so then what happens, right? And here are the benefits. So when you are educated in a setting where these conditions exist, these are the benefits. You're more likely to graduate, to complete your program of study. And the main reason for that is because you are exposed to intellectual diversity, critical thinking in the classroom. When you're in the room with people who come from very different places from you, just the way that we think about what we're learning is going to be different. People bring their own prior knowledge, their own experience to the content. And if everybody has a similar prior knowledge set and similar prior experience, there's not going to be as much sort of differentiation of ideas in relationship to that content. So the more diversity is in the classroom, the more we learn to think critically about whatever the content is that we're learning. Those perspectives influence what happens in the classroom. So all of us benefit from the fact that we're getting exposure to all these different ways to come at it. We call it divergent thinking, right? So contrast is really important. And there's quite a bit of research even on how it affects our brain. Is that the more that we are exposed to these ideas, the more that we're encouraged to consider alternatives, the more likely we are to consider divergent options rather than convergent options. And I don't know if people have seen that, Sir Ken Robinson, he does this RSA, Royal Science Academies, I think, I'm not sure. RSA They do these animated talks where they draw and talk at the same time. He has this one called Changing Educational Paradigms. You should look it up, it's great. But one of the things that he talks about in there is the research that shows that we are more divergent thinkers in kindergarten, and that as we go up in education, we become more convergent thinkers, because we socialize people to think a certain way as they move up in education. And in kindergarten, we tend to do the opposite. So in some ways, we'd all be better off if we were still taught the way that we were taught in kindergarten, to encourage divergent thinking. He gives some really good examples in there too. So that's the first condition, right? And then the second, that's the first benefit, is that you're more likely to graduate. Then you're more likely to be hired first, promoted faster, and earn more money sooner than your peers who are not educated, or who are educated in institutions where these conditions don't exist. So why is that? Well, as much as I, as a child of the 60s, want it to be because, we hold hands and we sing Kumbaya and we feel good about each other and we do it because we think it's the right thing, it's actually a business argument, right? And so let me just remind myself. The business argument, and this is really why we still have affirmative action in admissions in higher ed today. So there's been a lot of Supreme Court cases around this, circuit court and Supreme Court cases. The most recent one was the Fisher case at University of Texas, Austin. Prior to that, Gratz and Grutter, University of Michigan, the law school and the undergraduate admissions protocols, right? So how do we create diverse academic environments? How do we attract a diverse body of students? Some places it happens more easily, other places it has to be more engineered. So people are looking at different ways to do that are legal, right? And there's people who don't like that, right? They don't like the idea that it's a social engineering. But what's interesting is that business and industry really like it. Why do they like it? Because we live in a global economy, right? And so lots of businesses and industry, like many of them, signed an amicus brief to support the University of Michigan, to support the University of Texas and other institutions that have been challenged on how they're trying to create diverse educational environments, the demographic piece. Because they want students who have been educated in places where these conditions exist, because they know that they will come out of whatever degree program that they were in more well prepared to collaborate, to work with people who are different, to be willing to report to or supervise people effectively who are different from themselves, and they will just feel more comfortable coming in the door, right? Hitting the ground running with this idea that diversity, that multiculturalism is the normal human condition. Right? So they don't have to adjust to what does it mean I'm being supervised by a woman, I have a problem with that, right? They don't want to deal with that. They want you to come in the door and bring your intellectual capital and be ready to go because there's a profit motive, right? And as much as that pains me, right? Because I want it to be a humanitarian motive, I'm actually happy that we have this as a tool to use, because I feel like this is one strategy that we can use to move equity forward. Right? And then eventually maybe we'll get past, right, the business argument and we'll get to the humanitarian argument in the process. So I use it as a tool because I think it's compelling for people who tend to think that this is a liberal or even a left-wing agenda. It's really a pretty neoliberal, conservative, market-driven agenda. Okay, so I think we'll make it to the end. So this other piece that I've sort of touched on several times before is this idea of cultivating contrast. And I like to give this example, these two examples, right? Because they're from two different faith traditions where there's a lot of a history of tension and conflict and ongoing tension and conflict. So these are two religious quotes from religious texts that I like to use. So as I said before with this educational benefits of diversity, critical thinking is a big piece of it, right? And so equity and diversity education focuses on the value of contrast, which is really what's at the heart of critical thinking. Critical thinking, actually, we know for sure, makes us smarter. So this first quote that I've sort of adapted from the Quran by making it both male and female, right, is it's from a tradition. I'm not Muslim, it's not my tradition, but I feel like it is an important point of reference for me learning about my faith and other faiths. And I think what's interesting about it is it talks to us about the value of contrast in coming to know ourselves and to know others, right? That there is some intrinsic value in contrast in terms of how we come to know, right? Knowing is embedded in contrast. And the other one, I think, which comes from the Talmud, which is a Jewish religious text or mystical text, I also think it reminds us of how we all come to this idea of contrast from our own standpoint, our own positionality, and that we need to be reminded of that. You could argue in an academic context that seeing things as they are is really what we want people to do, but I don't think it means neutrality, though that's something that we say that we want to strive for in higher education, is this concept of neutrality or objectivity. And in a way, that's what the second quote is asking us to think about. Right? In my field, we would argue you can never not see things as you are, but you do have to be able to be critically conscious of that, right? To recognize that you are influencing how you're seeing. So I would argue that we can learn, and perhaps we learn best when we experience contrast, when we learn something that's not normative to us because we see it more clearly. Thus we come to see ourselves more clearly. For some of us, going back to that individual and group experience in the larger socio-political context, for some of us, seeing what is not normative is a more everyday experience. For others of us, it's a more rare experience. Right? It's based on who we are and the spaces that we occupy. So sort of in sum, the point here is that when we begin to see things as they are, as different from ourselves, we also see ourselves more clearly. And who we are influences how we teach and how we learn. So, and that doesn't matter, it matters regardless of the content that we're teaching. So this is another pedagogical strategy that I think applies across the curriculum. And we are getting a little bit close to time, so I want to just let you know that I'm almost done. I'll just spend a little bit of time on this. I do a lot of work around this with those group agreements in my class so that we can get to dialogue. I think that what people think dialogue is discussion, and I say that's really more like serial monologue, where people speak about a topic in front of each other and they often share. They can go around the room and everybody sort of speaks to the topic. Dialogue is more about speaking to each other about the topic, right? It's engaging with each other directly. What did you just say about the content? And let me respond to what you just said, not to the content independent of what you said. It's higher risk. There's more opportunity for it to be uncomfortable, but it is also opportunity for more rich learning and to creating what we say in my field is making classrooms oppositional spaces where students work with each other. We say not against each other based on race, but against racism with each other. So that would be one example, right? But it's this idea of creating spaces that are oppositional in an intellectual way for shared purpose coming out of it. What characterizes dialogue is that we're listening, as I said earlier, listening to understand, not to gain advantage, which is what we do in debate. Right? The debate rhetoric is a particular way of communicating where you're listening to find the weakness, the weak point in somebody else's argument to respond to. In dialogue, that's not the goal. The goal is really to understand. And so one example I often give is, I'm sort of exhausted about having conversations about abortion rights as a topic, right? Like to me, going someplace and having a conversation about abortion rights wouldn't be interesting, but I would be very interested in understanding everybody's views in the room about abortion and how you got to that view. Like, if we switch the conversation from just the topic to what it is about this, like what brings you to your perspective about this topic, to me, that's a conversation I really want to have. I want to understand. Whether we agree with rights or not is less, that's to me a more sort of charged, that's a debate. A dialogue is me understanding why you feel the way you feel about this topic and what in your experience or your education brings you to that position. That is a more dialogic way to approach the topic, if that makes sense. An example I often give in my own classes is that if I ask students, for example, tell me about where you come to you, it doesn't mean I agree with you. I think a lot of the reason we get debative or we rely on discussion is because we think that when we hear something we don't like, that it's going to get conflictual. And sometimes that happens, but it's like another muscle, right? We have to know that we can work through that. It's not going to get so conflictual that we can't manage it. And that's about learning to facilitate dialogue. It's a pedagogical strategy. But I think that in general, if we agree to dialogue, we agree in chairs, right? Like I set it up this way because I really believe, and I'm an educator, that people should be looking at each other's faces, not the back of their heads when they're being educated. You would think this is boring, not a big deal. I spend so much intellectual, emotional, and physical energy just being able to teach this way every semester, even in the College of Education, where we're supposed to be teaching people how to teach in schools, and we know, right, especially in the education of young children, that we need to move the classroom into different configurations for different activities. Kind of a space where people can look at each other for the purpose of dialogue as a pedagogical approach to teaching any content area it's contested. It's so contested. I have to fight all the time. First of all, there's a limited number of rooms where the furniture even moves in buildings. There's many rooms where it's bolted to the floor. And then I have to fight with people who tell me if you move the furniture, you have to move it back because there's a default or a normative classroom configuration and it's rows. And it's not fair if they have to move the furniture back. And I say, well, how is it not fair? I move it once, you move it once, right? That's fair. And so in past semesters, even in my own college, which again is the College of Education, right, our building, people from other disciplines, maybe from my discipline, I don't know who they are, but people have left me nasty notes on the board about put the room back, and I'll write something back and say back to what? You know, like, and it'll go back and forth, and we'll save it. Like, it'll get saved on the board for week to week to week, and I've had students take pictures of the conversation and post it on Facebook as it evolves, right? As a way of talking about how our second space assumption, even here, is that the normative classroom space is rows and looking at each other, the back of each other's heads. So to try to create just the third space of this, I mean, even Ashley and I struggled a little bit around finding a space for this because where we were originally scheduled wouldn't allow us to do that. And I said, if it's possible, I would really like to do it because it's a big part of what we do in my field, right? And so something so similar, so simple, so mundane can be this huge, huge issue, right? But it's important to fight for this, to create third space, as an example. Okay. Last slide is that I just want you to think about, second to last slide, they're both really quick, is this idea of it's important to cultivate contrast, to help people see things as they are, to know others and to know themselves, to foster dialogue, to listen to understand, but not with the expectation that you're going to agree. That's not the goal. And to create third space for yourself and others. And then finally, this is important in our field, and I think it's important in general, which is to consider if what you do or say takes dignity from others or causes you to lose decent dignity with others. So it's not just about how being insulting makes other people feel, but it's how it makes you look. Would be a person of color. So when my husband, who is a person of color, read the test, he was thinking about himself as the practitioner and the patient as white. And the instructor actually told him that he answered the question incorrectly. And then when she realized her own bias, she got mad at him. Because she realized that she looked stupid for making this assumption, and she couldn't admit the error and say, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I screwed up. Instead, she took it out on him and she went after him, right? And tried to get him kicked out of the program because she was so uncomfortable with, she felt that this was confrontational from him because he raised this as a concern about how it was marked on the test, right? So again, the assumption was, this person is not in the classroom, so I don't have to consider them in terms of how I engage this particular issue, right? And so I think it's very important to always remember, no matter what you're talking about, architecture, math, science, you just don't know, but you have to assume that whatever the conversation is, it's in the classroom, so you want to think about that with respect to this piece. How do you affirm, how do you make sure everybody in the classroom feels good about being there? Okay, so that's the end. If you're interested in doing a master's or a doctorate in this content area, we'd love to have you. So these are the programs that I coordinate in the College of Education, and that's it. Thanks very much.